Welcome back, everybody, to Season 3 of the Legal Weekly Wine, where we discuss the week's hottest legal topics. This week, to start us off with a big bang on Season 3 at the beginning of the fall, is truly this week's hottest legal topic of the Georgia indictments against former President Trump. This is the fourth set of indictments that we've had. These are state indictments versus federal indictments, and we are here to explain what they are, what exactly they mean, and what the future holds. I'm Virginia Tehrani. I'm a full-time practicing attorney in Maryland, D.C., and Virginia with Tehrani Law, LLC, because you never need a lawyer till you do. And I am joined by the illustrious Constitution scholar, Dr. John Vile from Middle Tennessee State University. Thanks for joining us today.
It's a pleasure.
All right, so that is our big topic, and I know you and I can be a little bit long-winded, but I think it's really important, especially in this case, so we can break down the true meanings. You and I have seen and heard a lot of news reports this week. They are ongoing. But I think the two things that have not been talked about much that I'd love for us to discuss today, in addition to many other things, are first, what exactly is the big deal about electors from Georgia? The actual electors, the real electors versus the fake electors. What does this mean and why is it important? Why would it be a crime? And then I'd like to discuss on the second part of it, why this actually would fit into the RICO statutes. So kind of put them together hand in hand and join it up as to, we've heard a lot about RICO, what it means, what it is, but I want to apply it specifically to this case to say, I think this is why the RICO statute is being used and why I think it might actually be successful if it can be proved. As usual, everyone is innocent until proven guilty. And that's the system that we work in.
This is a grand jury indictment, not a petit jury decision.
Correct.
And just word to the wise, you know the expression, a good district attorney can indict a ham sandwich.
Absolutely.
So, which doesn't necessarily mean that they try to do that. I mean,
correct.
They have their own codes of ethics, and especially on a high profile case, it frankly would be very embarrassing to have as many indictments here and then end up with nothing.
Yes.
So, and that accounts, I think, in part for why we're almost 3 years, close to 3 years into the Trump administration, and we're, finally getting this set of indictments. Yes, I'm sorry. Right, Biden administration.
Right.
Away from the Trump administration.
Clearly in reading, this is a 98-page indictment.
Yes.
And to really slog through it, I appreciate the multiple accounts, and we're even one of them, the weighing in on the topics. But to really read through these 98 pages, just like with the ones that we have with Jack Smith, the detail in here isn't just, okay, he committed a crime or these other people committed crimes. The level of detail is to set the stage of what the overall conspiracy was, what the overall, in this particular case, the, goodness, I'm trying to think of the word and I have it, enterprise, there we go. The enterprise is that they're all engaging in, and it's a step-by-step process of utilizing this actor from here, that actor from there, and putting all of the pieces together of, this isn't one thing or two things, it's a series of activities and speeches and comments and letters and emails and phone calls, when all put together with all of these different players, amounts to, allegedly, racketeering enterprise and activity. So what I'd love to do is start off, because this is happy hour. It's happy hour. We always enjoy our weekly wine with our discussions because, frankly, about now we need the wine with our discussions. And you should join this. But our trusty bottle of water with Dr. Vile,
I switched.
Are we doing Coke today? Nice. Okay.
Coca-Cola, please.
Coca-Cola. So even for you, it went
We're not
beyond.
doing Coke. No.
We haven't gone to illicit drugs, but we have at least moved up to caffeinated beverages. Okay, that's how important today is. And for me, I am doing a black cherry blast. It's from the Olney Winery with me in Maryland. So a little bit of a picture here. It is a stronger alcohol content, so you will not see me drinking more than one glass here today. But I figure since we're having a blast on, and this is quite an alarming topic, that was appropriate for today. So cheers to happy hour. Grab your own glass of wine or other drink to enjoy the conversation. Here we go. And that is a cherry blast. That is really good. It's actually very much like one of my favorite wines called Cherry Wine from the Mariah Winery and Vineyards that I find in Manassas, Virginia. So that's quite lovely. All right. So I would love to know, since you know everything there is to know about the Constitution and our electoral process, we talked a few weeks ago about Jack Smith's indictments. And we talked about the Electoral College, and we talked about the January 6th hearing and what the purpose of that hearing was. Can you give a quick recap as to, constitutionally speaking, what is supposed to happen at the January 6th hearing and the meeting of Congress?
Right. There's some preliminary stages. When you go to vote for president, typically you're actually voting for a list of names for people from his or her party who have pledged to elect them. Each state gets a number of electors based on their total number of members of the House, which is based on population, and then 2 senators. So every state has a minimum of 3 electors, including, by the way, by constitutional amendment, the District of Columbia. So there's a total of 538 electoral votes. 100 for the Senate, 435 for the House, and 3 for the District of Columbia. To win the presidency, you need to get 270. And all but 2 states, Nebraska and Maine, if I remember correctly, do a winner-take-all system. Now, that's not required by the Constitution, but it gives the state more clout if they can say, well, we're going to give you all our electoral votes. And so most states have gone with that. So what's supposed to happen is that the states are supposed to, the electors are supposed to assemble in their respective states. And that's done, by the way, to avoid conspiracy. Each state delegation meets separately. They cast their votes. Then those are written down, and then they are sent to the president of the Senate, who happens to be the vice president. And the vice president in a joint session of Congress opens the ballots, announces X has all, X votes from the state of Tennessee or Texas or Maryland or whatever it is. And then in the end, you add them up and one person is declared the winner as long as one person has 270 votes or not. If they don't, then, and this hasn't happened in a very long time, but if no one got the 270, then it would go to the House of Representatives, who would choose among the top 3 candidates. That, by the way, is how, and I think it may have been 5 candidates then, but that's how John Quincy Adams became president.
Oh, interesting.
Andrew Jackson had more votes, but Henry Clay, who was like 3rd or 4th, and I can't remember what Crawford did in that election, but the short of it was the forces against Jackson sort of combined, and so John Quincy Adams became president. Now, traditionally, the role of the vice president is what we would probably basically could say is ceremonial. Mm-hmm. He has not, to my knowledge, ever exercised independent judgment. Now, there was a time in the 1876 election when Congress had to set up a commission to decide on disputed electoral votes, and that commission ultimately resulted in the outcome in that election. But typically, the president simply gets up, reads the votes, and then makes the announcement. So 1960, the vice president was then Richard M. Nixon. He had the duty, the pleasure, whatever, of standing up and saying, John F. Kennedy, who ran against me, is the new president.
I didn't win. I'm announcing somebody else won.
Right. In 2000, Al Gore had a very similar experience. And Al Gore had actually won the popular vote. But nonetheless, partly because of Bush versus Gore, the last state to be decided was Florida, and it made the difference. And Bush ended up winning the election. So prior to this time, to my knowledge, no vice president has ever thought his duty was any more than, the ring bearer in a wedding.
Right.
It's not his job.
Presenting it on the pillow. Here it is.
Right. So pretty much that, or the crown bearer in a monarchy. John Eastman, one of Trump's attorneys, apparently with others came up with this idea that, if we can get rival, slates of electors, we can at least keep anybody from getting 270. We'll just say they're disputed, so they can't count. And then maybe in the meantime, we can, twist enough arms, get enough fake electors or whatever to do the election. So this is, it's pretty fundamental to the electoral system. It's how, now, plenty of people, by the way, criticize the Electoral College.
Right.
Why don't we just go to direct vote? And actually, this election might, if this becomes the norm, maybe we ought. Maybe it would create less problems than this system does.
Sure.
But traditionally, it's sort of worked the other way. Usually, a person wins a greater electoral number of votes percentage-wise than they do popular vote, and so it makes the election seem a little bit more, solid. Everybody has to recognize the votes and whatever. But what happens here is apparently Trump and his allies got together and attempted to create, and here's one thing that I don't quite understand, is I don't understand why they didn't, except I guess maybe they couldn't get them to do it. But you would think what they would have done is take that original set of voters who had been pledged to Trump and had them say, we won. But apparently, rather than do that, they actually got other people to say, well, we're going to certify that we're electors. Now, one of the problems, though, and that this comes out in this indictment, as in Jack Smith's, as I understand it, is there are allegations that some of these people said, well, I'll step into the breach. If there's a chance that this state's elections were miscounted or votes were not counted or there was fraud, I will gladly sign my name so the proper person will be elected.
Right.
And some of them apparently did it in good faith with the understanding that your names would only be presented in the case where clear fraud was shown. And, there's some comparisons between this election and 2000. And
yes.
The first time I read this, it's like, okay, could either Gore or Bush have been indicted? And I think the answer is no.
So and I'm glad you brought that up, because that was going to be my question is, there's the debate about the hanging chads, right? Oh my goodness.
Right. Well, that was the Florida case. Yes.
Right. So what is truly the fundamental difference of the First Amendment saying, look, I'm disputing these votes. I don't think they're real. I don't think they're right. I'd like them recounted. What's the difference between demanding a recount and what happened with Bush and Gore versus what's happened here, allegedly?
Yeah. Well, the main difference is in Bush versus Gore, for better or worse, Bush eventually prevailed in the court. The court said, we're going to stop the recount because there's not a fair way. You don't have criteria that are distinct enough and clear enough that we know if somebody is fudging the numbers, or if, do you count a hanging chad or do you not? Do you count a folded ballot or do you not? Do you count an early ballot or a late ballot, et cetera, et cetera? But the difference is there you went to court and you had a resolution. Now, people went to court in this case.
They did.
There were, I believe, close to 70 cases. And ultimately, all of them went against charges of fraud. And in fact, the attorney, I believe none other than Trump's people themselves, 4 or 5 weeks before the election, were saying this is going to be the cleanest, fairest election we've ever had. But then, if you remember, was either the night of or the night after the election, Trump gets up and says, we've won.
Yes.
And that was quite contrary to the evidence that existed at that time. But you certainly have a right to say, something fishy is here. I don't understand. And in Trump's case, remember, he had discouraged people from casting early ballots.
Yes, that is
and
true.
So what happened is the people who voted early, and usually your early ballots are not counted till after the others, as strange as that seems. So in this case, what happened is more Trump people went to the polls probably on election day than Biden people, because a lot of Biden people had been encouraged to vote early. I was going to say early and often, but there doesn't seem to be evidence that they voted often. So your initial count, as often happens, anybody who ever watches election night, they will say, well, we have votes, but they're from Philadelphia and it's heavily Democratic, or they're from West Virginia, they're from this little town in Maine, and typically they vote Republican. So it really wasn't, now Trump also says, well, he got more votes than he did and apparently he did. Now, one should realize that in 2016, he actually didn't get a majority of the popular vote.
Which is funny because it's vice versa. Is he actually won the Electoral College and not the popular vote?
That's right.
Election.
Right. And now, of course, he's claiming that he won both. But as it's gone state by state, court by court, the courts have said no. And, the predicate of this indictment and the indictment of Jeffrey Clark, they both start out by saying, and I think you
mean Jack Smith.
I'm sorry, I do mean.
There's so many names going around. It's okay.
But I mean, the first sentence of Willis's indictment: defendant Donald John Trump lost the United States presidential election, held on November 3rd, 2020. And went on to say one of the states that he lost was Georgia, but he refused to concede. Not only did he refuse to concede, he apparently tried, and there's pretty good, again, he's innocent legally till proven guilty, but we've all seen tapes where he says, all I want is, one more vote to get me over the top. I don't particularly hear how you find it, where you find it. That's what I want.
Yeah. And then one of the ones that was most disturbing to me, if true, was the one to the acting United States Attorney General allegedly saying, just say that the election was corrupt and leave the rest to me and the Republican congressman. Is another one that was more, if true, seems alarming, is don't say that it was corrupt because it was corrupt, but just say that it was, and I'll figure, I'll take the rest from here.
What's fascinating about both these cases, despite what your mother and I taught you, it's wrong, but it's not illegal to lie. Correct. People do it all the time. And in fact, how do you know a lawyer? I was going to say a lawyer, a politician is lying. Well, their lips are moving. Their lips
are moving.
That's what people say, probably unfairly. But what what RICO does is say it's one thing to get on television and lie to the American people, as heinous as that is. It's another thing to call an election official and say, we have evidence that we don't have. Or, why don't you do this? Or why don't you help me in this way, knowing that you have lost the election? And, frankly, the only defense, well, no, I would never say only defense, but, your one defense as president particularly would be to say, well, I genuinely thought that I did win. I'm a wishful thinking kind of guy, positive thinking. The problem with that is politically, if it's true, it's almost as damning as lying intentionally, which is, you mean after all the, your second presidential election, you still can't figure out how it works.
Right. And after being
How
told by
competent
how many people, how many judges, how
Right.
many everything that you lost, why would you still
But-
perpetuate this idea that you have?
May I get on a hobby horse here a minute? Because what most bothers me about what's happening here, and this is taking place among not just Trump, but many of the Republican candidates. What are they saying? They're saying the Justice Department has been weaponized.
Right.
Well, these jurors are not members of the Justice Department. And Fani Willis is a state official. She's not even a federal official. Mm-hmm. And there are all kinds of checks and balances that have been brought into the special counsel and all this other. And it worries me that people are going, traditionally, Republicans particularly were the party of law and order.
Yes.
They were the supporters of the FBI and the police and the judicial system.
They were against the defund the police campaigns.
Well, right. And they were rightfully opposed to that. There's plenty of abuses among police and they do wrong, they be brought to justice. But, as my dad used to say, if you're in trouble, you're going to call the police, you're going to call a hippie. That was sometime back.
Era.
In any event. It worries me that we're defending a man over institutions that have, and this sort of goes with this whole deep state critique.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sort of a defender of the deep state in the sense that if what you mean is we're going to have people in agencies that know the rules very well,
right,
are well educated, have a lot of experience, we need them. No president, Woodrow Wilson. I'm doing some writing on him right now. He was as educated. He was as educated.
We have some history with Woodrow Wilson and speaking back and forth.
He was as educated about the U.S. Constitution as any of his predecessors, except maybe James Madison. But there was a lot that he didn't know about government.
Right.
And we need, these bureaucrats that we fuss about are the bureaucrats who make sure we get our Social Security checks or make sure there's aid that goes into Hawaii and places, get our mail delivered, all the goods and services that we've accustomed to getting.
So what I would like to do is, in speaking of this being Georgia related versus federal related, one of the questions I kept having, and I don't know if anybody else has this thought, but I have a suspicion that other people do, and will hopefully be thankful to hear some answers on it, is why in the world of all the places, why Fulton County, Georgia? Why is there a state proceeding? Why is the jurisdiction Fulton County, Georgia? Until I saw this indictment, I had not wrapped my head around why can that Georgia prosecutor, the state prosecutor, bring a case in Fulton County, Georgia? Why is this not D.C.? Why is, I understand Jack Smith in D.C. That makes sense to me. But this Georgia case didn't until I read the 98-page indictment.
Right. Well, they're arguing, this conspiracy, if that's what you want to call it, racketeering enterprise, took place in a variety of states.
Correct.
And one of the closest in terms of the vote count, I believe it was about 10 to 11,000 difference was Georgia. So if you had a choice, you don't want to go to a place where you're losing by 1 million votes. You just be utter, nobody's going to take it seriously. So here was a state, it's a purple state rather than a red or blue state. So you have a chance that, he could have won there. What's fascinating, and I guess it's Fulton County because the capital is Atlanta. That's where the electors would have met.
Right.
I'm supposing that's what gives the jurisdiction. Now, by the way, Mark Meadows, who seems to have cooperated at the federal level, is trying to get his case moved to federal jurisdiction. And you're going to know the jurisdictional issues better than I am on that. But what's fascinating about Georgia, two things. And one I think we raised before with a question, but I do now have the answer. Were Trump to be convicted in Georgia, the president of the United States cannot, no matter who it is, pardon him.
Correct, because it's
My
a
understanding
state
is
conviction.
nobody can pardon him till like 5, or I believe it's 5 years, but whatever.
Right, and it's after 5. So a federal official cannot pardon. The state can.
Right.
But
the president can only pardon offenses against the United States.
Correct.
So this is an offense against Georgia. It's federalism, division.
Correct. So versus the state of Georgia. So it's the state of Georgia. Yes. Now, Georgia can, but only after 5 years of serving a sentence and based on the Board of Parole. It's not the governor who allows it. So that is true. But for me, in going through this indictment with the fine-tooth comb, I actually applauded the Fulton County jurisdiction because they're bringing in, now they are saying, and I wrote it all down, they're alleging an overall conspiracy, like you said, an overall enterprise and conspiracy. And we're going to come back to RICO in just a second, but they're saying there's a huge conspiracy set up of which Fulton County is a part. But we're part of, there's Georgia, there's like 7 states. They're saying interference in Georgia, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Arizona, Nevada. Yes. So they're saying all of these, and they're citing continuous activity in each of those states. Who's called, who's met, electors that are represented. But in Georgia, what I thought was very well done in this indictment is that it was finally clear to me, okay, we actually have more than just this call to the one person in Georgia, right? There's the one that President Trump is calling the perfect phone call.
Raffensperger.
Yes, Raffensperger. But that's not the only thing in this indictment. They're saying 3 different dates, December 3rd, December 10th, and December 20th. That those dates in particular, and December 14th is going to be another critical date, that those 4 different dates culminated in hearings and meetings in Fulton County, Georgia, in which players in this enterprise and in this conspiracy specifically met, had meetings, had hearings in which they took testimony.
Which would have been under oath, right? In many cases.
Under oath testimony in which they cast ballots, in which they made statements. So there's December 3rd is the Georgia Senate Judiciary Subcommittee meeting. That's the first. Then December 10th is the House Governmental Affairs Committee meeting in Georgia, in Fulton County. And then on the 30th of December, not the 20th, it's another subcommittee meeting, a Senate Judiciary Subcommittee meeting. And then on the 14th is this Fulton County meeting of the fake electors. So these 4 different dates where Willis is saying, look, this is how it hits Fulton County. We have jurisdiction because in our state, this enterprise specifically came into our state, into our county, held these meetings, petitioned our governors, our electors, our state legislators, and they named different ones of them.
And let me add something. Election workers.
Yes.
And if you remember, one of the most, I thought, striking parts of the testimony before, were this mother and daughter who all kinds of accusations are being made against them that are apparently absolutely false, and that, they were fearful of leaving their house. And by the way, another development that has happened since this was issued is apparently the names and pictures and addresses of these folks are now online.
The of the election workers or the grand jurors?
No, well, the grand jury members.
Yeah.
And, think about it. I'd probably like to be on a grand jury just because I feel like it was part of history. But, this is not a walk in the park.
No.
You listen to hours and hours of maybe very complex testimony, and, you hope you have a DA who's, leading you in the right direction, but you want to keep some lookout to make sure somebody isn't being railroaded. And then, to get blamed for issuing an indictment, it's ridiculous.
Yeah, no, it's scary.
If do we believe in the rule of law? Yeah, we believe in the rule of law when it goes our way. John Kennedy said, heads I win, tails you lose.
Right.
But it's.
And I think that's where we get into the First Amendment issues. And this is what's also happening, and I'm going to parallel it to D.C.
Yes.
Is what's happening is this huge question of, is it a crime or is it a First Amendment right? What are we doing? And in D.C., if you'll recall, the judge there had that hearing last week where it was, what protective orders do we have? And they also had an issue of what pretrial are we agreeing to? And she was like, you're walking a very thin line.
Right.
And the question is this intimidation? And intimidation of witnesses and obstruction of justice, those are crimes. That's not free speech. So.
They're serious crimes.
Right. They're serious crimes. And what the judge in D.C. could rightfully do, who also, by the way, this week has been subject to death threats.
Yes.
By a Texas woman who called all sorts of racial slurs and said, we're going to watch out for yourself and your family and your children. We're coming for you.
Well, in the meantime, a man has died in Utah for making threats against the president and coming out, with an AR-15 or whatever it was.
Right. And so what's happening is she said, be careful of your statements because I will make extra measures if these types of statements are being said. And he could say, I'm not trying to do it. But there's the implication of the words, especially from someone so influential, to not check his words and to know what they may or may not be saying. So either Georgia, who's still at this point in our broadcast, and maybe by tomorrow on Friday when we actually put it out or however we do it, is I think he's going to surrender next week. But bail and bond conditions have not yet been set. But either in this Georgia bail and bond conditions or in D.C., he could be subject by a judge to saying, you can't use your Truth Social account. You can't make statements or we're going to jail you because you cannot use your platform to intimidate witnesses. And for this, the most concerning one to me was his own statement on Truth Social on Monday. And this was before the grand jury came down with their indictment.
Come after me?
No.
That one?
Well, there's that one, which is also concerning. If you come after me, I'll come after you.
Right.
But this one was very specific. And imagine, like you're saying, of being in grand jury, imagine being a witness. And this is what's put out to all the country. And you know this, that the former president has a huge following. And the former president puts out, quote, I am reading reports that failed former Lieutenant Governor of Georgia, Jeff Duncan, will be testifying before the Fulton County grand jury. He shouldn't, end quote. Yeah. Now, if there is anything close enough to witness intimidation, this would be it.
It didn't work.
It didn't work. And thank goodness it didn't work, right? But it doesn't have to work to be intimidation. That's what's coming out in this Georgia indictment for poor Ruby, is what seems to be laying the foundation is she and other election officials who were presiding in Fulton County were being accused of rigging the election, of switching votes to Biden, of ballot stuffing, of all of these things. They're being accused of these things. Their names are being plastered, especially Ruby. There's testimony by Giuliani in front of the Senate Judiciary Committees on these dates that Ruby was ballot stuffing, that she was doing all these other things. And then there's evidence in the
false allegations.
Right, false allegations, what have become known as false allegations. Right. But you're putting her name, you're putting the governor, you're putting the lieutenant governor, you're putting all these names out there, and you're saying, and people are calling, and people are coming by, and people are coming by to the neighbors' houses, and people are like, it seems to be, and this is where I want to go to the RICO Act, is a lot of people are criticizing using the RICO Act. And there are some criticisms. If you want a really nice, bundled prosecution, RICO is not the way to go. It's more complicated. It's complex. It's complicated. You have to prove a lot more. It's not as a nice, tiny bow to present to a jury. It is complicated.
But who's the paragon of bringing RICO indictments? Whose whole career was based on that?
I don't know.
Rudy Giuliani.
Oh.
That's how he started out as a DA.
Okay.
And he used it against organized crimes and all kinds of similar groups.
Oh, I didn't know that.
There's an amazing irony here.
Oh, I didn't know that.
The other thing I guess most viewers know by now is apparently he can't pay his legal bills.
Yeah, I've seen that.
Trump has not apparently paid his bills to him, and now has less incentive because if he does, then it will look like it will be furtherance of the conspiracy.
Right.
So, Trump can go to his supporters and say, help me out here. And that's sort of the tactic, right?
Yes.
They're not coming after me. They're coming after you. I need to use your campaign money to help myself out. Giuliani, to my knowledge, doesn't have that.
Right.
And I'm not about to create a fund to help him out.
Right. Pay your own legal bills.
Yeah.
So for me, it's, when I think of RICO, and a lot of us, the genesis, the foundation of it is mob bosses, right? Mafia and the mob, where you can't get after Jimmy Hoffa by himself. You got to go after the organization. And if you can go after the organization, then you can hit the high hitters. You use the lower henchmen to get to the boss, to get to the godfather, to, that sort of thing. And that's how we think of RICO, because it's technically, for those of you who don't know, RICO actually stands for Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. That's what the title is. And there's the federal act.
By the way, just so we're clear, I'm not sure Jimmy Hoffa would qualify.
Am I saying it wrong? What do you think he would be instead?
He was a union leader, and I don't know the degree to his skill. I think he was convicted of something, but there are other sort of Godfather types that probably would fit a little bit closer than he would.
Perfect,
but
thank you.
Same general principle.
Yeah, and so the idea is that they're creating they're so corrupt. These organizations, these gangs, these mafia, these organizations that are improperly influencing governments, right? That they're entrenching themselves in a city, in a jurisdiction, in a county where they are the rule of law and influencing the rule of law instead of the actual lawmakers. What do we attribute to mafia and mob bosses? We attribute them to bribing public officials, paying them off so they'll look the other way while they do. Exactly. While they do their, we think of alcohol, we think of prostitution, we think of drug running, we think of all of these things. Or gangs, which are using henchmen, so to speak, in the wrong word, of going and committing other crimes. But what we're forgetting about is these organizations, the fundamental part of this is to run corrupt scheme to undermine the government, to undermine the actual law.
Right. And elections are integral to democratic Republican government.
Exactly. So in my mind, the law fits perfectly. It is an enterprise that is trying, and there's a whole list of...
How would you distinguish, this is a good question for a lawyer, why do you think Jack Smith used conspiracy continually, whereas she uses racketeering? Do you think that, there must be, and, people congratulated Smith on avoiding so many of the First Amendment issues, and it looks like she actually has a few more in here, although, their conversation, the irony is a lot of her facts, it's not a crime to have a phone call.
Correct.
It's not a crime to do a tweet, but if you can show that they are all directed to some kind of overall conspiracy,
Yes.
then it's no longer free. I can talk about how much I dislike a certain politician, but once we start talking about, hiring somebody to shoot him, I'm way out of the realm of freedom of speech.
Exactly. And I think that goes to the two of them together. So let's look at them combined as they both charge conspiracy.
Yes.
So she has the overall RICO, but she has also alleged conspiracies, right? So there's conspiracy to commit false statements in writings, conspiracy to commit filing false documents, conspiracy to commit forgery. And they each have several common grounds that Jack Smith does. As we talked about last time with Jack Smith's indictments, conspiracy isn't just, committing a crime. Conspiracy is an agreement to commit a crime.
Plot, basically.
So it's a plot. It's an agreement between two or more parties plus an act in furtherance of that agreement. So you don't have to commit the actual crime. Your act in furtherance doesn't even have to be a crime. It just has to be something you've affirmatively done that goes toward implementing and concluding the conspiracy, even if the actual final crime never happens. That's the same as Willis's indictment. She has the same effect. There's these overall conspiracies between two or more actors, and in this count, I've charged 19 of them, and their acts and furtherances. So these phone calls that you're mentioning, it's not a crime to make a phone call. It's not. And she's not saying it is. What she's saying is that one phone call furthered the conspiracy and the objective to overturn an election. It continued the enterprise of making false and fake electors, of presenting them as true electors when they weren't our state's actual electors. So the difference that she's done is she's gone above that. She's done the conspiracies, but she's added the RICO. And for the state of Georgia, it's a different rule. So it's very similar to the federal rule, but it doesn't have the same statutory constrictions of time. In federal rules, it requires a longer period of time, sometimes months, sometimes years. Georgia doesn't have that. You don't have to be an enterprise conducting a conspiracy or, your activities over the course of months or years. It just is an enterprise. So what she has is she's put together offenses or acts in furtherance of an enterprise that began right before the election. So around October 31st is when she's alleging that this started through January 6th. So her timeline is much shorter and is allowed under the Georgia rule. The Georgia law also allows enterprises to consist of one person. Now, she doesn't say it's one person. She says it's 19 plus unindicted, other unindicted people.
Am I right that in Georgia, if you're convicted under RICO, it's a 5-year minimum sentence?
It is. It's 5 to 20 years.
Which is, I don't know that that's more than federal, but I believe it's mandatory in a way that maybe federal, you could plea bargain it or whatever.
That's also my understanding. I'm not a Georgia attorney, but based on my reading of the law, that does seem to be how it goes. It's a mandatory minimum of 5, or at least the statutory constrictions are 5 to 20 years. Some may be able to be suspended. But that's how it reads. So what she's done is she's been given through state law an extra count that I don't think Jack Smith had available to him based on the timelines for his rules, for the federal rules. But I think she's played this very well because she's used in the Racketeering Act. It has a list of 34 different crimes that could be. And most of them, like I said, are prostitution, drug running, that sort of thing. But specifically, government corruption, gambling, bribery, forgery, false statements in writings, impersonating a public officer, perjury, influencing witnesses, tampering with evidence, intimidation or injury of grand or trial jurors or court officials. These are crimes that are specifically said in the Racketeering Act that if you set up an enterprise to affect any of these or commit any of these crimes, then you're guilty of RICO, however you want to pronounce it. The RICO laws, and I think she's used this beautifully. If she can make it all work, if she can make all those elements of proof to prove that it was an election won for Joe Biden instead of Trump, if she can prove that there were fake electors, and a lot of this is based on the December 14th meeting where the fake electors were called in Georgia, right, and they cast their ballots. They presented themselves as fake officers. That's where part of this comes in. And
again, if I can combine this with Smith,
please.
It is possible that some of them did not fully understand,
Correct.
It's possible that the representation they had was that their votes would only be used in the case that fraud or, vote tampering had been proven.
Absolutely.
So you can't necessarily say, some of them, I think, clearly did what they did knowingly.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure that all of them did.
And I'm not saying that they did. I think the bigger idea here is that it's not necessarily those people, but the overall conspiracy to get those people, to submit them as fake officers, whether they knew it or not. So it's the 19 who have been charged. And they keep referencing in here the unnamed, unindicted, unnamed people. They don't even call them co-conspirators. Whereas they're in Smith's indictment, they're the unnamed co-conspirator number 1 through whatever. Here, I think the other interesting play that Willis makes, and speaking as a former prosecutor, I think she's done well and something different than everybody else, where she said, I'm not doing just Donald Trump. They're all coming in.
And of course, the problem with that is you could potentially have a trial of 19 people.
And that's what she wants. That's what she claims. She wants to try them all together. It's probably not going to happen.
Understand, she may have to wait in line behind Jack Smith.
Absolutely.
And even if she doesn't, the likelihood that all 19 people could hire their attorneys, make their case prior to the next presidential election, I think is even slimmer than that for Clark.
Absolutely.
So, typically,
that's the strategy portion of it, the actual, how it will play out. For me, I'm speaking more about the strategy of even indicting 19 people, of saying, who's going to really accuse me of being a weapon against Trump? It isn't just against Trump. This is against everyone that I believe had a role to play in our state, who came into our state and tried to influence our election, make false claims against our electors, our election officials, and meddled in what we believe we were doing right. Again,
and by the way,
allegedly.
I think it's likely that the offenses in Arizona were as great as the ones here, possibly those in Michigan.
And that's what it suggests, is if you read through this indictment, you're exactly right. The alleged crimes that are coming out that she doesn't have access to, that she can't indict through Arizona or Michigan, but they can still be used to prove acts in furtherance of this continuing illegal enterprise, is that there were acts in New Mexico in Arizona and Nevada and Michigan. And I saw a report that at least several reporters have been contacting the Attorney General in Arizona saying, hey, what are you going to do about this? And
one
they
thing,
might have their own.
Lest what I said earlier sound partisan. One thing that's important to remember is none of these conspiracies, if that's what they were, worked.
Correct.
And they didn't work. And it wasn't because Joe Biden opposed them.
Right.
It wasn't because Democrats opposed them. It was because Republicans stood up and said, not in our state.
Yeah.
You about ready?
Yeah, and I know your time's running out, and so is ours. But I appreciate that, and same. We try to be neutral in here. It's hard as a former prosecutor, and seeing these, it's like, wow, this is really damaging. But I'm also a former defense attorney, and as we stated at the beginning, innocent until proven guilty. I love that we do have a system of laws, and I'm trusting our judicial process to work. Not everybody does trust that, but I would like to believe that it does most of the time.
And you never need a lawyer?
And you never need a lawyer till you do. But dang it, please don't call me for this one. I am happy to comment all day long on the sides, but I would not like to be anyone's attorney for this case. Just the commentator. But anyway, so thank you for talking with me more in depth about these indictments as far as what they mean and the electoral process, which again, I think is important to always go back to. Enjoy the rest of your weekend, everybody. Happy hour. And we will catch you next week for the second episode of season 3 on the Legal Weekly Wine. I'm Virginia Tehrani, and this is Dr. John Vile of Middle Tennessee State University.